Hi, my name is Shane Unger. You might know me from my 2016 documentary on schizophrenia. Recently I had written a book to further discuss my story and schizophrenia. I have now decided to provide the entire book here on YouTube. You can find this book on Amazon and the Kindle store. I want to thank everyone for the support over the years. Oh, and there is no way I could ever hire a voice actor, so this will have to do. Without further ado, let's start. Shift, My Story and Schizophrenia, by Shane Unger. Forward. Where to begin? The story of my life is peculiar. In these few years of general clarity, after what seemed like a never-ending journey, I find myself sitting here typing. It occurred to me today, that deep down, I just want to do something meaningful with my life. It's been almost a year since I've been able to engage in any of my old dreams and hobbies, and honestly it's been killing me. But with a bit of willpower, I was able to start writing music again, only to realize that it's not that I can't write anymore, but that there are greater things in this life that require my attention. I need to share my story. Back in 2016 I made a series of videos in which I tried to do just that. Shortly after, I was unable to continue and concluded the series with the hope that I would seek alternate methods to fulfill this dream. However, I lost sight of this amidst my own everyday struggles, and although I have continued to blog here and there, it's not quite what I set out to do. Since then I have seen the views on my video reach tens of thousands, with such beautiful and inspiring comments. Maybe now I can finally finish what I started, and perhaps help those who seek understanding of this illness called schizophrenia. However, I want to include my whole life story up to this point. I personally think it's for the best, even if the main focus is schizophrenia. It's been a long 10 years, and I'm only getting older. I want to thank my family and friends for sticking with me. I couldn't have done this without you. Chapter 1, In the Beginning. I like to think I had a relatively normal childhood. My mother and father divorced at an early age, but my mom took great care of my sister and I. My father would still visit and take us to theme parks and to get ice cream. I still have many fond memories of those years. I remember when my father left, and I was confused when he said goodbye outside of the house. I also remember even before that when an earthquake knocked a Lego pirate ship off a shelf that my mother and I had built. But then there was school. Preschool and kindergarten, my first crush and my best friend. My mother worked full-time to support us, and would still take us to school and cook dinner every night. I never felt I needed anything. I even had stuff like video games and a large collection of toys. Holidays were always very special. My grandparents had a ranch, and every year at Thanksgiving the whole family would show up, well, my mother's side that is. My grandma always made sure to have a good supply of snacks and candy for us. And Thanksgiving dinner was simply amazing. One of my happiest memories in my life is all my uncles and my mother's boyfriend at the time playing basketball on the front driveway. As time moved on and we got older, my grandfather passed and my grandma had to sell the ranch. But it will always hold so many special memories, and I'm sure it played a vital part in my upbringing. Christmas, however, was usually spent with my dad's side of the family. Although we all lived so far from each other, every year for that special day we would be together. I would get to see my cousins and go on hikes with my aunts. Play Risk with my father and older brother, and we even tried to make a makeshift Dungeons and Dragons map. Christmas morning, the whole living room would be covered with presents. It was truly a sight to behold. All in all, I was very fortunate to have such a caring and loving family. And even to this day, I know I can always rely on their support and understanding. My mother eventually did get remarried to my stepdad. It's actually kind of funny how they, reconnected. See, they grew up and went to school together, and one day after all those years my stepdad had a dream about my mom. He got worried and gave her a call, and one thing led to another and the knot was finally tied. We packed up and made the journey to Arkansas, which I'm sure many know is an extreme difference to the suburban cities of California. But I was young, and it didn't really faze me that much. In fact, I remember being excited to move, but of course also sad to leave my friends. But Arkansas held no shortage of friendship, and on the first day of school I already found others to connect with. This led to a great bond, forged by years of school sports, ATV adventures, and an all-year-long 4th of July. Of course I was still young, but I was soaking the world up. I remember when 9/11 happened. I was in class when all of a sudden we stopped studying and the teacher brought the TV in. I couldn't really comprehend the devastation, but I remember being scared. My sister had called my mom and wanted her to pick her up from school. I know that these few years in Arkansas greatly shaped who I am today. The sense of adventure, the days of Baldur's Gate and Diablo, being in a wolf pack of friends, and really just getting a taste of another way of life. We did end up moving back to California, to where I currently reside in Fresno. It's not the same as Southern Cali by the coast, but it's where my stepdad could find a job at the time. When people ask, "Where did you grow up?" I always answer with Clovis, California. Clovis is on the northeast side of Fresno. I had begun really growing up, which I'm sure everyone understands can be incredibly scary. You start getting self-conscious, and the world begins to show its true colors. Although I was able to make best friends in my first year of middle school in Clovis, I really began to start judging myself. I would often enter dark places, thinking I'm fat or not good enough. Somehow, although I was still young, this sparked the beginning of my spiritual journey. My mother had never pressed any religious idealization on me. In fact, when I started building my philosophy, I had a clean slate. I will always be grateful for this. Not to discredit religion, but I honestly think children, especially in their teens, should be able to explore and find what holds true to their hearts. Of course, a little good-natured guidance is required, but I think everyone has to discover this sort of thing for themselves. And that's exactly what I started doing. Of course, school was important, and I had my friends, but when I got home and into my room, that's where the magic began. I started pondering the world around me. How does it work? Why do I feel so terrible? I don't want to feel this way, but I don't know how to fix it. I kept little journals of my writings, and would often share my thoughts with my friends and family. But when I discovered what you can find on the internet, I was hooked, for better or for worse. I started researching aliens, Eastern philosophy, metaphysics, quantum physics, and getting wrapped in the world of conspiracies and doomers. I was about 16 now. All through middle school I had kept to playing sports, but I decided then that I didn't want to play anymore. Instead, I wanted to focus on music. That's right. While my spiritual journey was flourishing, I had begun really getting into guitar. I would spend days blasting music, imagining playing the song on stage. I wanted to be a rock star, but not just any rock star. I wanted to be a shredding Alan Watts. I wanted to combine my spiritual journey with music. And one day, I decided I wanted to start a spiritual revolution on Earth. Fast forward a year, and I had already written some songs for this purpose, including Esoteric Revolution and No More. Eventually I would write Fly High My Son, but I'll get to that soon. It was around this time I actually fell in love. You see, I began to feel very alienated at school. I felt like everyone around me was so stuck in a false view of reality. Like they didn't even care about philosophy and spirituality. I know we were all still young, but that only made things worse. I met her in a Facebook forum for, you guessed it, spirituality. I was so head over heels, and of course I didn't really understand love, but my mind was set. I remember prior to finding her, I had had a dream of a beautiful waitress. Later I had came to find out that she was actually a waitress. Anyway, with all my creative willpower, I wrote her one single letter in which I introduced myself, and at the end asked her hand in marriage. She accepted. Mind you, we were both 17. But after that I was drunk with love. We lived across the country, but the thought of her just enveloped me with warmth. I would hold my pillow at night and pretend it was her. I began writing songs and making videos to express my love. I needed to emphasize this period in my life because it led to a very interesting experience. Well, a literal life-defining experience that shaped my view of reality forever. Before I continue, I want to provide the lyrics to the two songs I mentioned earlier. I will describe Fly High My Son when the time is right. But first up, is Esoteric Revolution. When will we stand out from ourselves? From our hells? And when will we see there's a better way, it will be okay. It will be okay. And when will you see? Like I do. In the spaces in between. And when the day comes when you finally do. I'll be there for you. I'll be there for you. Esoteric Revolution. Standing for our retribution. Getting rid of soul pollution. Esoteric Revolution. And there was another verse, but sadly I think it has been lost in time. The guitar I wrote for it was heavily inspired by the 90s punk rock bands I grew up with. Now here is no more. I'm finding it hard just to be here. My mind keeps pulling me away. What will it take for me to see clear? Without putting a bullet in my brain. I'm finding it hard just to talk. When there's so much I can say. When will this shit ever stop? No more, no more, no more, no more. No more. No more. Alright. Okay. I'm fine. Today. But I know it's just a matter of time. Before it comes. And I go numb. Never knew normal could feel so sublime. What the hell is wrong? I used to be so strong. Now that part of me is gone. Nothing is wrong. I can still be strong. That part of me is gone. No more. No more. No more. These are just a couple attempts by a 16-year-old to change a world he did not understand yet. All I thought was there is a problem, and I believed I was the person to change it. But back to the story. So, my father would take my sister and I on vacations. We even went out of the country to stay at a beach resort. During the winter, he would take me to go snowboarding at Heavenly at Lake Tahoe. Eventually, he introduced me to scuba diving, and inadvertently gave way to a deeper spiritual understanding of reality. We were to go to Indonesia, and scuba dive at some of the most beautiful locations on the planet. It was quite the adventure. It was my first experience with seeing a completely new way of life and culture. And all the while I was talking with my wife-to-be on Facebook. It was a complete roller coaster of emotions, and although there was a world of beauty around me, I couldn't get my mind off her. I was, however, still a teenager and reckless. One night, I stole a bottle of whiskey that was sitting on my dad's girlfriend's piano in the living room. All I was thinking is ooh. Alcohol. I hid in my room and began drinking. My father had let me borrow his laptop, so of course Facebook was open. I would listen to songs I wrote her and eventually half of the bottle was gone. I closed my eyes and noticed how vibrant my energy was. I was glowing with deep love, floating in what felt like infinity. Prior to this, I had already experimented with OBs and astral projection, so these sensations were not completely new to me. But I knew this was perfect to test out everything I've researched up to this point. I began focusing on a point right above my eyes. Next, I started pushing my energy outwards, and I could feel it almost draining. But it wasn't leaving me, it was me. Or what I think I am, or what I believe myself to be. Then, I was empty. But I felt complete unification with all the energy around me, almost like an egg. The glass is full even when it's empty. It was dark, but I knew better. This is what dreams are made of, and I consciously can have impact here. So I thought, I am swimming. And of course, I found myself in water. There were little fish swimming around me as I slowly paddled along. I next thought, I will come up to an island. And so I emerged from what seemed like a pool, to the most beautiful setting I could ever imagine. It was night, and the stars were vivid. It was sunset, and a purple and pink hue enveloped the island. I stood there, still in awe that it worked, but at the same time not too surprised. I opened my eyes, and there I was back in the room. I knew that instant that I would never be the same, and that the world around me had just had an explosive metaphysical transformation. I fell asleep like a baby that night. Of course, when morning came, I was completely hungover, and eventually my father found out about the bottle. I couldn't find it in me to regret it, however it was still wrong, and I understood that. I believe this never would have happened without the love I felt for this girl halfway across the country. I forgot to mention, in my early years of study, I had come across a quantum physics book which went into great detail into the double-slit experiment. I could not for the life of me wrap my head around how something like that could happen. So I read that same part over and over again until, like a switch, I was able to see it in my head and accept it. Whether or not that played a part in my later experiences, I do not know. But perhaps it all adds up. Adds up to seeing something more across that horizon. One day I actually talked to her on the phone. This girl I had been writing and dreaming of for what felt like forever. It did not bode well, and eventually she just stopped talking to me. I spiraled into depression and tried my hardest to get her attention. But slowly, I realized that it was over. School had been going okay, and I actually was in a great program for the study of multimedia. But I was so focused on my guitar and my plans, that I only did what I had to pass the class. When she left me, I kind of lost control. Negative thoughts began to resurface, and I even tried suicide one night by spraying insecticide in my nose and sipping bleach. I needed to get away. I hated feeling so alone, and that no one understood. No one except, maybe the teacher? He was a kind soul, who carried warmth around him wherever he went. In his bag he would carry incense sticks, and I found a deep sense of respect for him. But I wasn't going to open up. No, I had to leave. After a week of thinking about it, the day came where I was going to leave society and live in the mountains. I remember it like it was yesterday. I woke up and started packing my bags. I didn't really have a plan, but I was so dead set that I was just going to improvise. I packed my snowboard gear and boots, guitar, my journals, and a copy of Contact along with some philosophy books. It dawned on me that I might need something to eat, so I made my way to the kitchen to grab a loaf of bread and peanut butter. My mother stood there by the coffee pot and smiled and told me to have a good day at school. I said thank you and pretended everything was normal. I had written a letter the night before addressed to my teacher, in which I tried to explain why it is I'm doing this. I indirectly quoted some of David Icke's videos in the process. I left this letter on my bed and headed out the door. I stopped at the gas station and confidently made my way to the cashier to pay for the gas. The look she gave me made me feel like, well, a man. I was on a mission and nothing was going to stop me. When I finally hit the highway, and I watched as the town faded behind me, the excitement hit me hard. I was actually doing it. This is becoming real. The only plan I had come up with was to drive to the mountains. I had looked up directions and decided that was all I needed. But when I saw Road 420, I knew that's where I had to turn off. You see, I had been smoking marijuana for about a year, and it was already ingrained in my way of life. I may not have driven all the way like I had planned, but still forest surrounded me and I felt it was adequate. Eventually, I came to a dead end and parked my car. I grabbed my backpack and guitar and stood there for a moment. Here is where I leave society, my friends and family, school, and everything else. I followed the steep trail up to what looked like a power plant. There didn't seem like anywhere else to go, so I just started heading down the cliffside. The trees were thick and I almost tripped a couple times, but I made it to the bottom okay. I was definitely in a forest, however not exactly without civilization. I emerged onto a back road which led to some more houses. I was a little discouraged to see this so soon, but continued on without any direction. I hiked for about an hour until all I could see was forest around me. There was a natural clearing on a hill where I stopped and made a peanut butter sandwich. The excitement had not yet faded, and as I looked across the land I knew I had made it. But this was just the beginning. I continued to hike until my backpack felt like heavy weights upon my shoulder pulling me down. The guitar had become incredibly heavy as well, and my legs were beginning to give way. I would stop and rest for 5 minutes only to go on for another 5 minutes just to rest again. I knew I had to find somewhere to rest, and the day was beginning to turn to night. I found a small winding road that surprisingly had a lot of traffic. I thought it was kind of odd, but crossed the road and found a little clearing in the middle. There was a large boulder and I thought this would be a perfect place to stay for the night. Little did I know what the night actually had in store. I pulled the fern branches off the surrounding plants in an attempt to make some padding on the boulder. But it didn't really work out, so I shrugged and sat down. After a moment of silence, I began feeling very odd, almost uneasy. I was supposed to make it here and peacefully enjoy the solitude. Maybe read a few books, ponder the universe, etc. But I began to think of a hot shower. I had been hiking all day long, and was covered with dirt and small twigs. And then a comfy bed. I found myself in a dilemma. It was night already, and the cold air began to sink into my bones. I put on my snowboarding attire and boots, then returned to sitting on the boulder. I could still hear the traffic from the nearby road, and this comforted me, yet I couldn't help but feel scared of the eerie surroundings. I started thinking that aliens could land at any moment, or perhaps they were already there, shrouded in the darkness. This is not what I had imagined. Thoughts came rolling in like a storm. I began imagining my friends and school, and all the good times we had. And my family, of course. And what of these clothes that I rely on for warmth? I could not have acquired these without being a part of a society and civilization in general. In fact, I would never be sitting on this damned rock without everything that got me here. I couldn't stand the thoughts anymore. They were hurting so bad, and I was beginning to become lightheaded. At this point it had started to rain, and there was a little hole in my snowboard pants in which the water was trickling in. I began shouting and singing, just anything to stop thinking. I had enough, and I wanted to go home. But I didn't know where I was. I suddenly became very grateful the road was nearby. I decided then, that by tomorrow night I would be back home. And yet, I couldn't go anywhere in the dark. And I had no way of telling the time. So I stood on top of the boulder, waiting for the sun to come up. It had begun snowing, and I spent the rest of the night shivering and trying to warm myself up. I almost cried when the sun came up. The snowstorm had passed and the forest was covered in a small blanket of snow. It was time to start moving. I was not going to give up on my new goal. Of course, my first thought was to go to the road. I picked up my backpack and guitar, which the guitar case had been heavily damaged in the weather, and started to hike again. I've only seen hitchhiking in movies, but I understood that it could be incredibly dangerous. But I did not know what else to do, so stood on the side of the road with my thumb out. Of course cars passed me up, and I couldn't blame them. I must have looked crazy. But I spent about an hour trying with no luck. So if this is how it's going to be, then I'm just going to get there myself. I decided to follow the road. I mean, there is a lot of traffic, so it has to go somewhere. I had hoped I was done walking, because at this point of having not slept and strained my muscles for almost a whole day I was completely out of it. It was really pretty, and the small houses on this road reminded me of Arkansas. There was even abandoned shacks and small grass fields. But all I could think about is getting back home. I stopped for a moment and made another sandwich and wondered how much time I had left. I could try hitchhiking again, but I was a little discouraged at this point. But I threw out my thumb and started walking backwards. And then a truck stopped. I was a little hesitant, but my fears were relieved after talking to this man. He seemed incredibly concerned, and asked me sternly what happened. The first thing that came to my mind was to lie. I couldn't admit what happened, and I don't know if I was ashamed or just scared. I told him that I had been hiking with friends and got lost in the night. I immediately could tell he didn't buy it. But, he told me to put my things in the back and hop in. What happened next is something I would have never imagined. We started talking about stuff, and not just any old stuff, but music, and conspiracies, and the government. Of course, he would ask the same question here and there. What happened? I held strong to my lie, but felt very comfortable with this man. He asked where I needed to go, and I told him back home, but first I wanted to grab my car. I told him the road I had turned off on, and he laughed and said I had been heading in the exact opposite direction. But he needed to take care of some things in town, so I agreed to come with him. We stopped at an old appliance store, and then got some food from a fast food restaurant. He began telling me about his farm and musical instruments. And we continued the discussion of conspiracies, and we even got a little philosophical. Eventually we reached road 420. I told him that I could walk the rest of the way, and rejected his offer to drive until we reached my car. Before I left him, I stood at the car window and he looked straight into my eyes and asked one more time what happened. I lied again, and felt ashamed afterwards. We said our goodbyes and I thanked him and began walking down the road. I never did ask his name. I also did not remember how far this road actually went, but it couldn't be that far. But as time passed, I felt like I was about to pass out. I was so close to getting back home. After what felt like forever, I saw the hill and my car still parked. At this point I was so tired I just got in and started driving home. I felt like a robot. But on the ride back I could feel a trickling sensation all over my body as my muscles relaxed. My feet felt almost numb, and my eyes kept drooping. As I came in the front door, my mother was standing there. She looked like she had been crying, and just walked over to me and gave me a hug. An investigator was also there, and had a bunch of paperwork and files all over the kitchen table. He sat me down and began asking me questions, and that's when I let it all out. Tears were running down my face as I told him everything. He showed me respect, and talked to my mom for a moment, then left. I apologized to my mother and sister and told them the story. And finally took a shower and went to bed. I didn't tell anyone at school except my close friends what happened. The teacher whom I had written the letter for sat me down privately. He told me a bit of his personal life, and although I won't get into detail, it was very emotional. But after that I went back to class and continued on as usual. Humbled by this new respect for society, my friends, and family. This experience strengthened my dream for a philosophical revolution. I began playing guitar every day, sometimes for hours, and eventually discovered the beauty of improvisation. No longer was I playing the same songs over and over again, but something brand new every time I got on the guitar. During a vacation with my father, and after a long day of snowboarding, I began thinking of lyrics on our drive back to the cabin. Fly High My Son was written that evening, but I never really got to truly finish the song. As with the two other songs, I will share this now. It was a long drive back home. Started thinking about the past. The memories remind me that these dreams weren't meant to last. With life spinning out of control, I've always wondered why I ever stepped onto this roller coaster. Forgetting I could fly. Fly high my son. Fly high until the barrier's undone. Fly high my son. Fly high my son. At this point, school wasn't even a priority. I kept with my grades, keeping them at passable levels, but I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I was becoming quite the extrovert actually, and eventually made the transition from teenager to adult. I bought my first pack of cigarettes on my birthday, and I've been smoking ever since. I always tell people that's the worst present you can get yourself. But slowly, I was shaping into who I had to be to make my dreams a reality. One night, while I was grounded, I snuck my friends into my car so we could get stoned. I pretended I was going for a jog, but had made too many trips back and forth from my car to the house. My stepdad noticed the commotion in the vehicle, and came to see if someone was trying to steal my car. Of course he found my friends and I with a bong, and told everyone to get out. I stormed back into the house and kicked my door. I didn't want to live under these rules anymore. So I reminded myself I'm 18 now, and decided to pack my bags and leave the house. I called up my friend and walked across town. His father could not take me in, but told me he would buy me a hotel room to figure things out. There, I gave some of my other friends a call and was able to move in with one the next day. His father took me in and gave me a room. My independence soared. All of a sudden I felt so free to do whatever I wanted. Of course I respected the house and was grateful to stay there, but I really began to mold into the man I had always wanted to be. School was good, music was great, I had a girlfriend, weekends were spent partying, and all the while it seemed like I finally reached the end of my spiritual journey to enlightenment. I was playing guitar almost all day, and when I wasn't playing I was meditating. Pretty soon I began to believe I could channel life around me through the guitar. I drew a seed of life symbol, along with the quote, "Music is my God and I am his instrument" on the bass of the guitar. And I remember walking as if I was gliding on an ocean. I started practicing channeling my emotions through my physical form and getting into deep chakra meditations. And lo and behold, I was introduced to a studio manager who was interested to hear me play. I thought this was it, this is where it begins. Everything up to this point has led me here, and nothing's going to stop me. But something began happening. Something that I had never expected in my wildest dreams. Chapter 2, Schizophrenia. I've been dreading this chapter, and I know we've only begun, but this is where I want to relive those first years. I want to try and explain what had happened. And this presents to me an incredible challenge because, well, to put it in the best way I can think of, psychosis is like being thrown into a tornado. You are flung back and forth, not sure which way is up and down. The world around you begins to limit itself to what you see spinning with you. And gradually, you believe it. It's not your fault. It's just how it is. And if you are ever fortunate enough to crash down back on Earth, you'll never be the same. I think some people tend to have the misconception that hallucinations are like watching TV. No one complains that yes, it does catch your attention. And yes, it can influence your thinking. But it's not real. It's just a TV. It's not going to jump up and bite you. Why are you freaking out? And I totally understand this perception. Perhaps it has a deeper root, in our own views of reality. But in my experience, this is far from the truth. I can't prove what I see, nor can I honestly tell you it's there. You can't hear it, or taste and feel it like I do. And you're not the only one. It seems like most of the planet would agree with you. And thus, I have to admit you are right on some degree. But let's put aside thinking for a bit. You see, regardless of whatever we both think, I feel something's there. And I can't disregard these feelings. I'm sorry and I understand it's scary. I'm scared to death. But no matter what we both think happened, I cannot tell you from the bottom of my heart it wasn't real. I saw something, or I felt something, and I try to tell myself it wasn't real because I know the latter is a one-way trip. I don't know what's going on and I don't know if I ever will. And if I get lost in these emotions, and start believing it's all real, I hope to God I don't hurt myself or others, and that you don't hurt me. I have a psychiatric disorder. It is not easy to deal with. But I want to have a life, and I respect the good people of the world and want to do good, so if I have to fight my emotions and tell myself it's not real, then that's what I'll do. I don't want to be like this. I am incredibly fortunate to have found a medication that helps control my symptoms. I wouldn't be here, in fact I might be dead or locked up somewhere far away. And I'll take them regardless of how utterly terrible the side effects are because I am basically frightened of my own brain. I apologize for my sternness. I just hate stigma really. I'm not mad at people for not understanding either. I'm just mad in a general sense that schizophrenia is still not very understood. I know there are many great and honest people that are trying their hardest to help provide what they can for mental health. Some even looking for a cure. And I was going to edit the previous paragraph, but it came from the heart and I think that's important. I will revisit my idea of the nature of schizophrenia in a future chapter. I just wanted to explain this before I go and tell all the horrible things this illness has put me through. I've met people that still deny that schizophrenia is even a real thing, and it really just brings me sadness. But, without further ado, let's continue the story. I began hearing things. Things I couldn't explain. So naturally I had to default to the most likely scenario. I had no idea it could be hallucinations back then. What exactly was it? People talking. Or something talking. The first experience I can remember is writing music on the computer at my friend's house. As I wrote, I began hearing what sounded like two beings watching and listening to me. They would talk and admire the music I was writing. The only thing I could think of is the birds outside my window. They are the only ones that would be close enough to even hear what I was writing because I was wearing headphones. And not the little earbuds, but a nice over-ear set that I had often wore to school when I brought my laptop. Remember that I had a very vivid imagination, and telepathy was not that crazy to accept. And it didn't faze me too much. I have loved birds all my life, and I concluded that because of my constant exposure to music, I had developed an extrasensory perception. It was the only thing that made sense at the time. But shortly after hearing the birds, I began hearing people talking wherever I went. And it was very faint, and I couldn't always make out the words. And of course, this was easy to explain. My ears must have become ultra-sensitive to the point where now I could hear far distances. Then the voices began to make more sense. I would be at the park with my friends and see two cops in the distance. I thought I could hear them. That wherever I placed my focus, the sounds would break time and space and reach me. Now all this might sound crazy, but I tell you, do more research into the culture of the world, quantum physics and metaphysics, and maybe it will make more sense. The birds had instead become replaced by two men watching over me. How did this happen? Well, while in my room I had the idea that maybe it wasn't birds. Maybe my hearing was so sensitive that I was hearing through my other body in the afterlife. Sort of like in the film The Empire Strikes Back, you see Luke in the Bacta tank healing. That's how I pictured my next body, and the voices I heard in my room were two people in the afterlife watching over me. It made sense. And of course, the voices seemed to shape to that idea afterward, although I couldn't see that back then. And one night, they realized I could hear them. I think this is when my imagination seemed to start having a life of its own, to put it in words as best I can. I remember seeing the scuffling of feet as they left my other body. I know I put that sort of weird, but with schizophrenia you can experience things like that. The mind's eye is very powerful. I was still going to school, however I became pretty quiet. Not the same cool vibes I usually carried with me. I never told any of my friends what was happening. I thought I had it under control. At least until I heard the explosion. I was laying in bed, feeling very deep and relaxing sensations. My friend was in the same room with me on the computer. Out of nowhere, this incredibly loud explosion enveloped me. It was like my very soul was rumbling, and I could hear what sounded like strings. Like all the notes in all the octaves played together. That's the best way I could ever describe it. It only lasted a few seconds, not even long enough to get really afraid. I was stunned, but asked my friend the one very important question I'm sure a lot of those who suffer with schizophrenia understand. Did you hear that? Of course, my friend casually replied with, "Hear what?" I then tried to briefly explain what happened, but dropped it. He still didn't know what I had been experiencing previously. Even to this day, I feel that experience seems very out of place. But I can't argue that my symptoms increased tenfold afterwards. I began hearing what sounded like a radio playing. I would sit there in my room and listen very closely, trying to make out the words. I figured, going along the ultra-sensitive ear theory, that I was hearing the next-door neighbor's radio. I must say, that I wasn't in a full-blown psychosis yet. I still questioned my own theories, but it held little weight as they seemed to unfold perfectly. I could hear a woman talking. And she wasn't talking about just anything. She was talking about my guitar playing, and would announce it with great enthusiasm whenever I would start to play. So, the next-door neighbors were recording me. That had to be it. And it sounded like a college radio station. A college was actually right outside the window just down the road. I could find no other possible explanation. She called me the guitarist. At this point, I was pretty lost in the hallucinations. Whatever I determined as the most likely explanation was slowly becoming what was actually going on. I was still attending school, but as psychosis began to settle in, I started ditching. But I still remember those drives to school in the morning, hearing people talking in the other cars that passed me. And it all seemed to be about the guitarist. One night I had enough. Already I had determined that there was cameras in the room because the radio host seemed to react to my behavior. Not only were the neighbors recording me across the fence, but now they were spying on me. I wrote on a piece of paper that I had enough, and held it up to a little frog statue. The statue's eyes were dark, and it was the only place I could see a camera being. The host began to get really angry and make fun of me. But I tried to stay strong, and after getting out the shower bowed to mock them. But, that night something unexpected happened. I heard an angry man outside of the house shouting. And not in a mind's eye sort of way, but a dead real shout. I remember being incredibly scared. That I did not perform for the people on the radio, and now someone wanted to hurt me. After this night, the scenario shifted. I could still hear voices, which had become the neighbors now. But it wasn't just about the guitarist this time. People had found out that I was the guitarist, and that I wanted to start a philosophical revolution. The neighbors began talking about how much danger I was in. That people wanted me dead. And they thought I should leave town. I think it's safe to say I was in psychosis now. I was scared after the recent events, so I took the advice of the neighbors. I got in my car and left town to a little camping spot my friends and I had visited many times. And I was scared for my life. On the drive up, I began picking up a military frequency. They were saying Obama had ordered my assassination. I was to be shot shortly arriving at the campsite. So, after I made it to the campsite, I got out of my car and stood on top of a bench and put my hands behind my head. I was crying uncontrollably. I didn't want to die. The sniper was in the hills, and at any moment he was going to put a bullet right through my skull. But then I heard it was called off over the military frequency. My hands dropped and I continued crying, but out of relief. Next I had an extraordinary hallucination that was just as real as the man shouting outside the house. The birds in the trees were chirping, and celebrating. It was thunderous, and I remember smiling because I was so happy. And so ends the guitarist scenario. And this was only a couple days. Can you imagine years of this sort of thing? This was just the beginning to a life that would take me places that only exist in the wildest of dreams. But I shall try to continue with what happened next. I got back home to my friend's house and began crying. I think that after going through such an emotional event, you have a brief moment of clarity. I realized that even if this is all true, how fucking crazy it was. Then I remembered my friend had said his dad kept a gun in the house. So, I snuck into his father's room and began rummaging through his desks and drawers. I wasn't able to find anything, so I picked up my phone and called my older brother. I told him I didn't know what was happening to me, and I was scared. I kept crying over the phone, and I know he tried his best to comfort me. I didn't really explain everything I had been hearing or how I had left town. But I just had to talk to someone. But it wasn't over. The scenario seemed to shape into something completely new the next day. I had been sort of at peace listening to the neighbors being happy I was back and safe. But as I laid on the couch in the living room, I began to feel a light above my head. And with it, angels. See, I had done plenty of studying on chakras and meditations, and something like this didn't surprise me much. Of course, what little sanity I had left was dwindling. The angels began talking to me. And very vividly too. No longer was it the faint voices or distant radio, but I could hear them loud and clear. My imagination was now running on its own, and I would see sustained animated images in my mind. They told me I was a son of God. That my music was to save the world. That I had been chosen and nurtured all my life for this purpose. And I took it in like a sponge. Of course, by now my whole family was worried after I had called my brother. My mom took me back to school to meet with the counselor, in which I told her that heaven had chosen me. My friends knew something was up, and I wasn't showing up to class anymore. Shortly after I was sent to the hospital. It was my first experience in a locked facility, but it only lasted about a day. I of course lied to the doctor to get out as soon as possible. However, I do remember the angels pressuring me to finally tell another patient that I was a son of God. My mom convinced me to come back home, so I left my friend's house the next day. Nobody knew what was going on. I still wasn't completely telling the truth. She was doing everything she could to take care of me. But it wasn't long before I would go back to the hospital. Something happened to the light above my head. Instead of a gateway to heaven, it became a portal to another dimension. A very dark dimension, with creatures that wanted to torture me. I was sitting on the chair in the living room when I felt a sensation at the bottom of my spine. And it began to build upward, the energy pulsating around me. I must tell you too, that at this point I hadn't smoked marijuana in a couple of weeks. I began to feel incredibly frightened. That I was going to be transported into this other dimension. Not only that, but that this body on Earth would distort and move parallel to my other body once I entered the portal. My mom entered the room and the light left her face. I told her to strap me down. I told her she is in danger. I began demanding it. At this point the energy around me was bursting, and I felt at any moment I was going to lose control. She called the paramedics, and I was strapped down to the gurney. In the hospital, I had a revelation in this scenario. I figured out that the light above my head and the portal was just an artificial chakra placed above mine and all of the humans' heads on Earth by extraterrestrials. What had been happening to me turned out to be a test by these ETs. Shortly after I named these events the God consciousness tests. After I came home, that night another test began. The extraterrestrials told me that if I don't kill myself, that they would control my body and make me murder my family after I went to sleep. It only took about 10 minutes before I started slashing my wrist with a pair of scissors. I still have the scars today. But blood started spilling on the carpet. And I just couldn't keep doing it. So if I couldn't kill myself, then at least I can run as far away as I can. So I left the house and began walking down the street. The ETs told me that no matter how far I went, that they would continue with their plan. So I sat down by a fence and pulled out my lighter. I began burning myself, hoping that I would burn deep enough for blood to spill out. I watched my skin peel away and melt. But of course I couldn't keep it up. This whole time I was crying. And I gave up. I just gave up and began walking back home. I made it to the backyard where my mother was waiting. She saw the blood running down my arm and immediately called the police. And so began my third hospitalization. And more importantly, a key part in the testing by the God consciousness. I wasn't meant to save my family. I was meant to push myself as far as I could go, fail, then hate myself. Hate everything about me. So that the next test I wouldn't want to feel that way again. So it could push me further. I didn't see it that way back then, but looking back, that's exactly what happened. A very strange thing happened during this hospital visit. I remember laying in bed, when I was brought up to a council. Of course I was just laying in bed, but I could feel myself standing there before them. They then told me I was chosen. My family just couldn't take me back in. It was becoming dangerous and they had to take care of my little sister. So they asked my older sister's ex-boyfriend to take me in. And there began my first period of rest in between tests. This became a staple in the years to come. After each test I was allowed a period of time to recuperate. Here I was introduced to the Rothschilds. They started talking to me, and the father introduced me to his daughter. She had been watching me before the tests had even began. This period allowed me to go see my friends again. I was still driving, and I wanted so badly for things to go back to normal. But while I would be at a party, I felt like I wasn't there. I felt the life I knew and loved was fading. My friends were fading. I couldn't even talk properly and spent the night smoking cigarettes in the garage. There is actually a picture of this night, where we are all together. During this time I was actually able to finish school. I had dropped out of course, but somehow managed to go to adult school and finish the credits I needed to graduate. But I never got to graduate with my friends, or go to prom. I had asked the prettiest girl in school to go with me before my symptoms appeared. No, it was time for another test. This time, the secret society has determined I was not worth their time. In fact, they were going to hire some street thugs to come kill me and my sister's ex-boyfriend. We had been playing video games together and I had become attached to my life there. Thus began an extreme emotional battle. At this point I was a little hesitant to follow the hallucinations, but here I'll explain. You see, where these ETs got me is that it doesn't matter if I thought it was real or not. I didn't know if it was real or not. And that begs the question, what if it was real? Could I really let something like that happen? And I know I talk of these as tests, but back then I would easily lose sight of this and get lost in the emotional battles. Eventually I gave up. The couch was so comfortable, and I had almost begun to hope I could get my life back. So for the next hour, I laid there waiting for gangsters to come in and kill both of us. I fell asleep, and woke up the next day in which nothing had happened. I decided I would run away. I would just leave town and head to the mountains. I didn't want anyone to get hurt. So I packed my bags and started driving back to the campsite I had went to during the guitarist scenario. All the while the secret society was threatening me to stay. And as I was driving, they told me they had my older brother. I could hear him talking, worried and scared. But I wouldn't stop driving. I made it to the campsite and began to hike the trail. They began torturing my brother, and at this point it was real. But if I didn't run away, they could hurt more people. And honestly, at this point the thought of running away seemed right. So I kept hiking, listening to my brother's screams. I slept in the woods that night. Now, the next part is a bit of a blur. I think sometime during the night, while I was sitting in the dark, I was introduced to the idea that I had created an alternate universe. Remember that loud explosion? That was life itself mirroring through my soul. That was a big bang. It all made sense now. The guitarist and angels, Obama ordering an assassination. I was hearing and feeling an alternate universe, one that I unintentionally created. It was the world as I had perceived it before schizophrenia made alive. And my brother, who had been tortured and killed, was real. Not like my actual brother here on Earth, but my idea of him that got copied into the new universe. And they were conscious, living and breathing human beings. In fact, I remember the secret society had all my siblings lined up after killing my brother and began shooting them in the head. The story has been really fluid up to this point, but I have to apologize. I can't remember exactly how the next order of events occurred. The whole universe thing was the framework to build enough testing for the next year. It's just the memories are so scattered. It's not that I've forgotten, I just can't put them together in a chronological fashion. So for the remainder of this chapter, I will divide it into separate parts, each describing a period of time I do remember. I will try my best to remember the order in which they occurred. And in the next chapter I will describe the last and longest scenario that was the purpose behind all these tests and conditioning, in which afterwards I stabilized on the medication that I still take to this day. Part 1. I had made many trips to Auberry during those first years. It is where the campgrounds I mentioned earlier were, and I was familiar with the town. I have so many great memories of spending weekends there with friends, partying and staying up late to stare at the stars. But, I also have very dark memories, like the one I'm about to tell. I was at the gas station my friends and I usually stopped before driving down to the campsite. It was a hot summer day, and I stood outside my car. I was manic. People in the alternate universe had found out what happened, and they wanted me dead. They thought it was too much of a risk for me to be alive, and that my brain could affect the reality in which they lived in. After rejecting their demands to commit suicide, they sought other methods of influence. They were holding my ex-girlfriend hostage. By this point, I had developed very strong emotions for the people in the alternate universe. So much so, I saw them just as real as here on Earth. And they were going to kill her. I could hear her screaming and crying, and I would beg them to not hurt her. They told me to start walking up the road. So I did as they said. Mind you, there was a lot of traffic in this part of town and no sidewalks. The road had a gradual incline, and I could feel the pressure building in my ears. The captors put a pair of headphones on her head that was connected to my frequency. They told me if I let my ears pop, it would emit an amplified pulse that would basically blow her head up. So my first reaction was to stop, but they reminded me they'll kill her themselves if I don't keep walking. So that's just what I did. And I continued up that road for at least 45 minutes, putting everything I had into not letting my ears pop. They finally told me to stop and go off to the side of the road. I obeyed without any second thought. Next I was ordered to stare at a specific spot on a tree. If I were to break focus, they would kill her. So that's what I did. Every time my eyes began to lose focus, I would immediately redirect them to the spot. I had to go to the bathroom, so had to start peeing in my pants. But I never gave up. All of a sudden I was told that this has been another God consciousness test by the ETs, and was allowed to let my eyes finally wander. I started walking back down the road, with piss stains running down my pants. Car after car would pass, but I did not give a shit anymore. I didn't care if the whole world was watching me at that point. Not after what I just went through. The ETs told me they would pick me up just over the hill. So I began to try and climb, but it was too steep and the dirt was loose. I must have looked like a complete psycho to anyone who was driving that day. But this rest period was short-lived, and I was soon exposed to a completely new scenario that was built on the same framework as before. I remember sitting down on the side of the road behind some bushes, away from traffic. Here overlooked a long ravine that I gazed upon for a moment. All of a sudden I could feel energy begin to pulse inside me and flow upward. Remember when there was a light above my head that was the gateway to heaven? Well, the energy moved to the top of my head and consumed the gateway. I could feel them merge into one. Well, what this means, is that nobody here on Earth could go to heaven anymore. And nobody in the alternate universe either. It was gone for good. I wish I could continue, but everything seems to be a blur after that. Up until the day when I destroyed the other universe, and all the living beings inside of it. Part 2. Before I begin, I want to say I do have a brief memory of the heaven-consumed scenario. It involved me driving in the night, far out of town because I believed I was being hunted. Remember how I said heaven was consumed for both the real world and the alternate world? Well, it was kept secret in the real world to prevent mass hysteria. But those who knew wanted me to pay, and not just by death but torture. I remember stopping at the side of a road, waiting for them to finally get me. If anyone has seen Resident Evil: Extinction, you might remember the scene where the main protagonist is on her way to the tent where the scientists were surveying the chaos they just unleashed. They don't know where she is, but they know she is coming. Well, it kind of feels like that. But when they finally discovered my location, something interesting happened. See, I could feel their thoughts and emotions. How much they wanted to hurt me. And I could also hear their thoughts. They wanted to stick a mechanical contraption on my chest which slowly and painfully twisted and dug into my flesh. But I could feel them right outside my car. And they were confused. I wasn't there. The whole time they had been in the alternate universe. And all of a sudden it turned out that the real world hadn't been affected. That's about as much as I remember of that period, so now let's jump forward. I believe this next period occurred about 6 months after my symptoms first appeared. I was completely disconnected from reality at this point. Everything I did and my behavior revolved around my hallucinations. Somewhere along the line, the whole galaxy wanted me dead in the other universe. I had really discovered that I could truly affect anything I wanted there. The army was able to contain it by a device that fit around my head. Not my head as in the real world me, but the me that existed in the other universe. And the other me was in a coma. There was only a few soldiers left to guard my body, and we were all locked in a bunker. But what was I doing? I mean the real me. Well, I was right outside the house of one of my high school friends. I don't remember why I was there, and I think I had just gotten out of the hospital. The bunker was being attacked. These few soldiers had been ordered to keep me safe, and that's exactly what they were doing. There was 7 of them, 6 males and 1 female. They could talk to the real me by talking through the other me. But I began to get this very strange sensation. It was like the other universe was collapsing on itself, and everyone and everything inside it would disappear forever. All I had to do was give in, and oh how sweet that sounded. Can you imagine, that one day on the news they announced that there was one boy who could destroy you and the whole universe? What would your first thought be? And of course, I gave in. I thought it would all finally be over. That this was it, I was going to consume this alternate universe I had created, and in turn end the hallucinations. Of course at the time I did not see them that way. These were real people just like you and me. And I was going to kill them all. I wanted to be normal again. I wanted to see my friends. I wanted to end this nightmare. And this isn't like pressing a button or flipping a switch. It was a direct emotional battle. And I just gave in. I could hear the soldiers screaming as they were ripped from reality. It all fused into me. There was a brief moment of silence, but before I could catch my breath something peculiar happened. I started hearing the remnants of the other universe, as if even though it was destroyed, it had left an imprint in me. It was like I could hear echoes of the people that had lived there. I felt a very eerie peace. At least this should be better than what it was like before. Until of course, the Greys introduced themselves. Part 3. The universe I had created was gone, so now all that was left was the real world. And that means of course I would start hearing aliens. And eventually I was reintroduced to the secret societies. At this point I believed I was being telepathically harassed. And I mean it. There was not a doubt in my mind it was happening. You might be wondering where I had been living all this time. After staying at my sister's ex-boyfriend's house, I had of course been hospitalized. I must have stayed at the psych ward over a dozen times that year. But eventually they placed me in a home not too far from where my family lived. My mother would still visit and buy me cigarettes. But I barely saw anyone anymore. But this was a rest period between tests. And a rather long one too. I was able to function to the point I even started jogging for exercise. All the while I was talking to Greys and secret societies. I was also introduced to the Nephilim, a race of gigantic humanoids. But it wasn't all fun and games. I would still be put through minor scenarios as if to build my mental stamina. Like another form of training other than the tests. I will provide an example. The father of the Rothschilds had a daughter they kept locked up in the basement that they would rape. They introduced me to her one night, and to mock my emotions they put her on top of me and made me have intercourse. During this, I had to fight the sexual cravings to give in and enjoy it. Which I did. One day I was introduced to Intergalactic, a military operation on Mars founded by the Nazis. Alan Watts had been forced to become a general after leaving this Earth. At the same time, the Nephilim had been taking care of me as a space cadet. Kara was in charge of taking care of me for the remainder of my Earth life until I could be transported to their star system. I was given a choice. 1. I could complete my enrollment as a space cadet, or 2. Join Alan Watts on Intergalactic. And I could leave as soon as I wanted. Of course that meant I had to kill myself. I was so depressed and alone, that the thought of all of it finally becoming real was too much to fight. So I actually acquired a rifle the next day. I won't go into detail, but yet I got a rifle and one single bullet. I left for Auberry in the morning, and had made my decision the night before. I would join Intergalactic and Alan Watts. I had always looked up to him long before the schizophrenia even began, and I thought that maybe together we could make things right. Fast forward an hour, and I was standing in front of a loaded rifle. I had taped it securely to a tree with duct tape, and tied a string around the trigger in which I held in my hand. Alan Watts was there by my side, and they were ready to take me in. I softly tugged on the string a couple of times and then began to apply more force. For a moment it really hit me what I was about to do. I had seen enough live leak and ogreish in my life to envision what that rifle was about to do to my skull. I let go and paced a bit around the mountainside. I had hiked a good distance from the campsite, but where I was overlooked the valley and I could make out my car. Alan Watts asked me if I still wanted to do this. This was not a requirement. For once I can actually admit my schizophrenia had not pressured me to go up there. But believe me, of how dark a place I was in life, this seemed like the only option. I stood myself back in front of the rifle and picked up the string. I made sure my forehead was aligned with the barrel, and began tugging again. This time much harder than before. Bang! I stood there for a second, the shock of what just happened had me frozen. Any moment I was expecting the blood to start running down my face and to collapse to the ground. But nothing happened, and I realized I had missed. Then I heard another gunshot off in the distance. Someone knew I had fired my gun, and I wasn't alone in the area. Panic set in as I tried to peel the duct tape to get the gun off the tree. I ended up having to burn it off with a lighter. I wrapped it back up in the blanket I had hid it in on the drive up and started rushing back to the trail. I was scared, and tried to hide the rifle under some brush. I hiked all the way back to my car and locked myself in. I couldn't leave, because I had to go back to get the gun. So I ended up sleeping in the car that night, freezing. Temperatures can drop pretty low in the mountains. The next morning I awoke a little surprised that no one had come to talk to me. I made my way to where I had hid the gun and it was gone. Part 4. There was a brief rest period after this event, but the suicide attempts were just beginning. The alternate universe that I created theory resurfaced because I began to talk with life itself. See, it turned out when I had consumed the other universe, what actually happened was they contained it. The whole experience of consuming the universe was actually just a staged event planned by the people there to stop my thought from disrupting their reality. But eventually, the truth showed itself. You know how my thoughts could affect the other universe? Well, now I was talking to it. I was still hearing the Greys and secret societies, as well as Alan Watts and Intergalactic. But I was assured that the real world was not affected by any of this. In fact, I was left alone to deal with it. The other universe didn't want me alive. It's not natural for a brain to be literally intertwined with a universe. So it began doing things to the people there. And I must remind you, back then these were real people to me. But as long as suicide was my only goal, it wouldn't hurt them. All I had to do was kill myself to prevent the people from suffering. So you guessed it, I tried cutting my wrists and that didn't work. I drove up back to Auberry and tried hanging myself. I was sitting on the tree branch, rope around my neck about to drop down, but I couldn't do it. So then I had to save up money to buy a gun. And there was no brakes. I had to stay on my toes every second unless someone would get hurt. That means the moment I decided I would get money for a gun, I was in my car looking for every penny I could find. My mom ended up giving me some money, and usually I only used that for cigarettes for the most part. I ended up buying a pack, trying to convince the universe that it was necessary. It reacted by torturing the people. And what I mean by torture, is lethal waves of energy pulsating throughout the universe. I could hear and see a mother and her child pass out because of the energy. Eventually, the Greys and military stepped in and stopped the chaos. See, they could have saved the universe the whole time, but had watched me try to handle it. They had the ability to communicate and travel to this alternate universe I had created. Can you see the conditioning that took place? How I had to fight the want to give up, just like what happened at my sister's ex-boyfriend's house. To not give in to comfort and life I had created while living in that home. Almost like there was a deeper meaning to these rest periods. Part 5. We are going to fast forward another 6 months. I could try and pry my mind for further things to discuss, but I think you have the point now. For about 2 years I was mentally conditioned through series of tests that challenged my integrity. Most I was meant to be pushed to my limits and fail without knowing it, so that I would feel humiliated and set my standard even higher. In between these tests were rest periods, that perhaps were actually utilized to conduct complex emotional battles. All of it leading to the last scenario, which lasted about half a year, in which afterwards I was put on my current medication and stabilized. But I wanted to make a section to explain the events that occurred before my first conservatorship because it's something I think everyone needs to hear. This part is not going to be so much about schizophrenia, but the kind of life it threw me in. After one of my many hospitalizations, I was enrolled in an outpatient program in town. I was assigned a case manager who would visit me and handle my medications. She had helped me move from house to house after each living situation was lost. If I remember correctly, the manager who ran the first house I was in quit bringing us food. The next house ended up closing down. And finally I was living somewhere far from my family in a bad part of town. And as some of you might know, Fresno has one of the highest crime rates in the nation. One day I was walking around the neighborhood looking for cigarette butts, when a man stopped his van. He told me I shouldn't be walking around because I was white, and warned me to go back home. On another day, I was punched in the back of the head. I turned around and there was a black man with a shirt wrapped around his head and his friend. A woman also accompanied them. They told me to empty my pockets, which I did, pulling out a handful of cigarette butts and a lighter. They took the lighter and my basketball my mom had got me. There was a park right by the house with a couple of hoops that I had tried to play at back then. They then told me to take off my shoes, and I did and handed them over. The friend smelled inside the shoe, then threw it over a school fence. That's right, we were right in front of an elementary school. Finally they let me go, and I hurried as fast as I could without running to get back home. From that day forward I never left the house without being accompanied. It was at this house I was introduced to crystal methamphetamine by the next door neighbors, who turned out to be members of a gang. For some reason they accepted me. The manager at the house I was at told me that if I don't stop hanging out with the neighbors, she'd kick me out. So, I moved into the gang's apartment. There would be loaded pistols and shotguns on the living room table, and all the meth I could ever dream of. We would also smoke marijuana and play video games on the TV. And to be quite honest, I felt cared for. These men were criminals, but at the same time they treated me like family. I was still in contact with my mom, and actually called her one day and told her I was smoking meth and started to cry. She reassured me that I am not a bad person and that she understands addiction. And she would still visit and take me to the store and buy me snacks and cigarettes. However, money was out of question at this point. I was incredibly depressed and suicidal. All this time I was dealing with the schizophrenia too. I called up my case manager and told her I need to find somewhere new to live. And within a few days, I left that apartment and moved into my new home. And on that day I was hospitalized, and put on conservatorship after voluntarily admitting myself because I was going to start attempting suicide again. But this was not the end of struggling with methamphetamine, for I would eventually relapse after I returned to society. Chapter 3, Shift. So what exactly is this last scenario I've mentioned so much about? Well, I'm dedicating a whole chapter to those 6 months in which I'll try to relieve as best I can what occurred. There were many strange experiences, stuff I can't explain even to this day, in which I saw things that changed my life forever. You know those old fantasy movies like Labyrinth and The Never-Ending Story? Well, it became real. And it appears this is what I had been prepared for. No more tests or conditioning. This was it. And I'll tell you now that it was successful. During those 6 months, not once did I give up and saw it through to the end. I traveled through time, journeyed to the very edge of reality, and heck even saw the Black Pope on a bus. And it appeared schizophrenia became a little less confined to just my brain. I interacted with people in broad daylight. People like you see going to the store, or walking around the mall. You don't know who they are, but you certainly could never see them as a hallucination. And I swear they knew what I was going through. Just how far does the rabbit hole go? At what point do you become so deep into psychosis, that you'll jump into moving traffic without looking? Where you'll defend yourself believing that you can't get hurt? And to experience states of mind that lurk only in the deepest depths of our imagination. I've been trying to think of what is the best way to go about it. I've decided that just explaining the scenario in full rather than unraveling it chronologically as I had experienced is for the best. Imagine for a second, that life as we know it is but a fragment of infinite possibility. If you can imagine it, then somewhere far out there it's real. This is why we can imagine it in the first place. This is what dreams are made of. Life doesn't care about your logical understanding of self and your place in reality. We of course can determine from a universal perspective what we all agree to be true. What we decide is real or not. And that's the beauty of being in a time-space continuum. But we've all experienced it. Before waking up every day. We call them dreams in comparison to our waking life. But what makes this life real and the other things not? See, we live in the very foundations of infinity in which a seed can be planted and grown. Imagine our time-space continuum as the soil, and our bodies the seeds. It is a result of the nature of duality. With nothing, you have to have something. And with something, we can see everything, even nothing. Life never began. It will never end. To believe this is illogical. You can't measure the ruler with the ruler. To put it basically, whatever we believe is real could only be founded on the principles that anything could be real at all. Hopefully, we will never have to worry about any of this. Even after death. Hopefully we have another time-space continuum to call home so we don't get lost in infinity. That there will be a signal and others to guide and welcome us. And we will to continue to sustain a universal perspective. Really let that all sink in. That there are infinite versions of you existing. That life does not end at the edge of the universe. And that we are all a part of a never-ending story. Now, try to imagine that somewhere out there in infinity there was an I. Not a conscious I, nor an I as we interpret physically. But a place where everything around it reflects matter, light, consciousness. It's like an endless mirror, yet there is no mirror. And if you live long enough to completely understand everything that has ever been known, and to have had a pure heart your whole life, you could trick this I to shift reality itself. The impossible can become possible. And imagine that this was known to those with the ability to understand it. And that this had become a military operation on a galactic level. You see, this is not the first time this had been conducted. Ever so often, someone is chosen to bring an era of peace and harmony by shifting life itself. We have to do this, because inevitably life falls victim to duality. So we have to trick it, otherwise everything could become just something like before in the nothing. And with it, much pain and suffering. I was chosen to be trained and exposed to very strenuous situations in order to understand life to the point where it could see itself through me, and trust in me with all its heart. That's the only way we could ever prevent the end. You might remember I said life does not end, and I mean it. But we can end. This universe can end. Everything we know can end. Life will go on, but we will be no more. So now I've examined the first years of training, but what about the shift itself? How did we actually go about it? Mind you, the greatest minds in history were at work. We had to go to the very edge of imagination in order to fulfill the quota. I had to breach far out of the spectrum we perceive ourselves in. The very line that divides reality and fiction had to be severed. I saw things that I cannot explain with words. I just can't. I was literally in a dream. And I can never forget, and it will influence me the rest of my life. I had to be put in such a state that I would reflect the I reflecting me. And in turn, my thoughts would shift the very fabric of reality. And my thoughts became the thoughts of the collective inhabitants of our universe. After successfully breaching the barrier, we applied our heart's deepest desires. To continue to live, for life not to end. For peace and harmony. I've stared across the horizon, into the endless depths of infinity, and saw the future of all life rolling in with the clouds. It was a successful mission. Not because of me, but because of all of us. My pain and suffering over the years had not been in vain. We have prevented the end. And one day, someone just like me will have to experience all this over again. But until then, we have saved ourselves. Now for the remainder of the chapter, I will try to elaborate a bit more on what was going on. And how afterward, when it was all over, I was put on my current medication, and ever since then I haven't experienced anything close to what I've described so far in this book. We had to do a couple things before the shift could occur. 1. I had to be shown my true self and be at peace with my deepest fears. One of which, was a little girl named Samara from the movie The Ring. I was put through a scenario in which I became very close to her. I had to see her in a new light, not the horrifying depiction we see in the movie. I had to be exposed to a new story, one that I had to help shape into a better ending. One where I could see her with the utmost love and compassion. We had to break the fear because it was one of many things that could hold me back. All the questions I still had about life had to be answered. There could be no room left for doubt. I had to be completely sure of myself, life around me, and completely confident in everything I did. And I was exposed to many dangerous situations in the process. But let's take a step back, and let me give you a proper understanding of the setting. I was on the streets. I had left the house I was at because I saw something very vivid and frightening. I had to be free to do anything I wanted, and go wherever all this took me. I ran down sidewalks dancing, shouted loudly in the middle of shopping centers, stole from stores, talked to people as if I knew everything about them, trespassed and entered properties, slept in very dangerous places, and even got naked on a public road. I was hospitalized a couple of times in the process, but even there it continued until I got out, and then I was free again. I lit my head on fire in the middle of suburban Clovis. I was threatened by real people, sometimes with my life. One man took me into his hotel room and tried to have sex with me. Another smoked meth behind a grocery store and wanted me to masturbate for him. And one night I was assaulted by a drunk man, in which I ran away from. But, I felt I ran faster than I should have. I drank water from the faucets outside liquor stores, ate food from trash cans, and smoked every cigarette butt I could find. I would ask for free matches at the tobacco store and sometimes enter a fast food restaurant for a free cup of water. This was Clovis. I had walked across town and was in the very place I grew up in and loved. I had barely any clothes on and no shoes. My legs were covered in dirt. I had lost any weight I might have gained over the years. I would talk very loudly and walk in circles. I would sleep out in the open, or sometimes hidden behind the little bushes you see lined across the sidewalks. One night I also masturbated in a very lit area that was exposed to one of the most busiest streets in town. But all the while I was facing my deepest fears and doubts. It was a tedious process, but all those years of training prepared me for this. And not once did I let my guard down. I was the true definition of psychosis, to the point I believed I traveled through time. Everything I was hearing, smelling, feeling, seeing, and tasting was without a doubt true. And I hope someone asks the people of Clovis what they saw. My behavior. And who was that boy? Why was he walking around digging through trash cans and dancing in the middle of shopping centers? What is going on? Why was there at one point multiple police cars on Shaw, and at least 5 cops questioning him? And for those who were there, why did this boy trespass on our property? One person found my wallet laying on the ground and got in contact with my mother. She was able to find me, bought me a sandwich and drink at the store and took me home. It seemed everyone knew about the boy lighting his head on fire, and some recognized me and told my mother. We ate dinner and she called the police. I was then hospitalized again, only to come back. I couldn't stay there, my behavior was out of control. So she did the only thing she could and asked one of the old board and cares I stayed at during my conservatorship if I could live there again. But I had to get a shot before I could move in, so she took me to a local clinic. There I feared the needle would feel like a knife stabbing into me, and refused the shot. I stormed out of the clinic and my mother tried to stop me. I yelled at her and accused her of things that only psychosis can bring about. I then returned to the streets without looking back. My mother tried to follow me in her car, but eventually lost where I went. One day it ended. After the shift occurred, I entered a short rest period. I had ended up being placed in the home previously mentioned after a hospitalization. Within a couple of weeks, I had stabilized a bit although still not completely in touch with reality. I actually got in contact with one of my old friends, whom I had seen throughout the first years and kept in contact with. I told him I needed a place to stay and he said I could move into his shared apartment. So I moved in but was only there for about a couple of weeks. You see, after the shift, it seemed like I was gradually calmed down and put back into the usual conditioning. Nothing too crazy, but still scary and controlling. I started causing problems in the apartment because of course I was in no position for a life like that. I couldn't take care of myself, let alone even make a decision like that. Pretty soon I was back at the hospital and placed into a psych ward. There, I was put on the current medication I am on today. The doctor told me this was the last combination they could try on me. After leaving the psych ward, I returned to my friend's apartment but already was asked kindly to move out. So I called up the board and care and asked if I could come back. They didn't give me an answer, but I told my mother that I was moving there again. She picked me up and all my belongings and dropped me off at the house. There, the manager, whom I had known through the years, said I couldn't stay there but would take me to a friend of his that ran a room and board. So we got in the car and drove to the other house, which would be my home for the next 2 years. The manager there supervised the medication, and I was put on a strict regimen where after some time things began to change. I was still hallucinating, but it was different now. I was stabilizing, and although it was a very rough road, I eventually reached a point I could spend time with my family again. I started writing music, playing video games, and I even went to college. I only lasted a couple of weeks, but you get the picture. Eventually an argument between myself and the house manager began over the time I should take my medications. I decided I wasn't being treated fairly, so called my case manager I had been assigned to and asked her to move me somewhere else. And that's where I met my current caretaker, and have been with her for almost 3 years. And now I'm sitting here typing this. Chapter 4, The Aftermath. So I think I got the hardest part of the book out of the way. I'm sure I could make a novel out of the shift scenario, and maybe I will someday, but for now I hope you have a good idea what I've been through. And I hope that maybe now you see this illness is not to be taken lightly, and poses a great challenge for the human race to not only understand but, dare I say it, find a cure. It may not seem to affect your life that much, but if anyone you know or love ever becomes ill, maybe now with the help of not only my story, but the stories of millions of people across the globe, you can be better prepared for the situation. Because I wasn't. My family wasn't, nor my friends. So now that that is over, I decided I would dedicate this next chapter to my life as it is. And how over the years I stabilized and regained the ability to live a somewhat normal life under these circumstances. It is still very difficult to deal with, and I struggle every day. Not only do I hallucinate, but I am still emotionally damaged from everything I experienced. I rarely leave the house, and spend most of my time in front of a computer. It was a very bumpy transition. To find yourself to see clearly again after years of delusions and suffering. And to finally be without akathisia, well, at least a substantial decrease in symptoms. But I have already planned a chapter just to discuss this side effect, because everyone needs to know about it. But to put it briefly, my body just does not respond well to antipsychotics. At all. In fact, all the different brands I took before my current medication gave me severe akathisia. And no one did anything about it. No matter how obvious my symptoms were or how much I complained. And no one told me. It wasn't till I found a comment one day mentioning it, that I finally looked it up. I told my doctor at my next appointment, in which he didn't even argue. In fact, I was prescribed other medications that very day to combat this side effect. I struggled with akathisia for years, and the whole time I just wanted to die. Forget about the hallucinations and tests. This alone was enough to drive me to suicide. Akathisia is not livable. It's just not. And the thought these medications are prescribed without proper supervision is just frightening. But I will continue on this subject later. For now, let's just say with my new medication I was relieved to a certain degree of this side effect. It was not instant. It took years for my body to finally adapt, but when it did, I finally really sat still again. And felt the euphoria. I was actually comfortable. It's been so long that I forgot what it felt like. And I shot off like a rocket. At the same time, my hallucinations had become more docile and understanding. They weren't trying to get me to kill myself, or drawing me into grandiose scenarios. In fact, these days they can be even compassionate and loving. That's not to say things still don't get out of hand from time to time. Hallucinations are just one part of the puzzle that makes the whole. I'm pretty sure akathisia, along with the emotional strain the scenarios exposed me to, severely damaged me, perhaps for the rest of my life. But I have to say it has gotten better. I mean, look at me. I've written 30 works of music, totaling over 200 songs. I made a video which has reached tens of thousands of views. And now I'm writing this. Just how far I will go I don't truly know, but I'm in it for the long run. As long as my medication provides sanctuary from the worst of my schizophrenia for the rest of my life. I see family on holidays, indulge in hobbies and entertainment, heck, even stick to a daily routine. But I still see things. I still hear, feel, and taste and smell. But it is tolerable to a certain degree. The real problem I have these days is the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. And also my sensitivity to the world I perceive. I can't be too close to people physically unless I start feeling things. It's like I feel them and their emotions. And it envelopes me to a point where it can be hard to breathe. But this does not mean I cannot love. In fact, I've had a couple of relationships over the years. Some were out of desperation and ended pretty badly, and one, the woman was just too beautiful, I couldn't accept she was really interested in me. I think I have become more humble, and instead of causing any more pain I am waiting until I can truly admit to myself that I could fall in love with someone. I've gained weight due to the medications, and side effects such as drowsiness and lack of motivation can make it hard to exercise. But I know if I truly believe in something, I will try my hardest to make it happen. You might have remembered I said I attended college for a short time. Well, the whole previous summer I worked out and lost over 60 pounds. And when the day came to finally go to class, I dressed as stylish as I could with my current wardrobe. And people stared. And eventually it became too much for me to handle. I remember throwing my textbook on the ground in the parking lot and walking home, never to go back. It's gotten to the point where I don't even want to bother with having a social life anymore. And I've fought my loneliness and depression long enough to become somewhat numb to human behavior. But deep down I know I want to have friends and relationships. And I want a girlfriend and to get married. It really shows from time to time. I drink a lot of coffee. Well, enough to keep a steady stream of caffeine in my system. I had never been a coffee drinker until the last 5 years of my life. I found that it helped me focus, and so did cigarettes. But these habits have very adverse effects, and now I am just too addicted to ever be able to quit on my own without proper motivation. And by proper motivation I mean anything from love to potential life-threatening circumstances. The thought I could get cancer or have a heart attack is not enough to keep me from caffeine and tobacco. It really has to become a reality, it seems, for a proper response. See, I don't really think like a normal person. And my mind has been clear enough to remember time before schizophrenia, so I say this with utmost confidence. See, I still hear and see things in my head 24/7. It disrupts thought flow to the point where I still just feel a complete disconnect from the world around me. That's not to say I don't think and can't understand. I just don't comprehend things properly all the time. It's when I truly believe in something my knowledge and wisdom and creativity flourishes. I may have an illness, but I have a heart just the same as everyone else. And it burns. And sometimes it explodes into the world. Over time I have somewhat begun to redevelop thinking patterns. There can be moments of time where my thoughts flow into very complex ideas and subjects. But no matter what, my hallucinations will always be there afterward. And I talk to them. Not willingly, but because it's just the natural response. I don't talk to voices because I want to, I talk to voices because they talk to me. I think it's really just that simple. And after accepting that this is just the way it is, a strange sort of bond becomes established. But they can still really piss me off, or scare me. Sometimes even throw me into slight manic episodes. And I think now more than ever is the best time to talk about what it is I hallucinate. So the testing is all over, and the shift was successful. So now what? Well, basically, I have been assigned caretakers. Maybe they are here and dominant to prevent my imagination from running wild. They force me to take the medication, but if I ever stray away from it they usually slowly convince me to get back on routine by gradually introducing symptoms. And it always gets to a point where I remember everything that has happened. I really have no choice in the matter. There is a female Grey, or Zeta as I like to call their species now. Her name is Tara. There is also a male Zeta, but I'm not allowed to name him. Then there is what appears to be the military. There is a very strong and stern man that comes in from time to time. Then there are females that sometime have sex with me. And not in the way you think, but it's like we share bodies, so when I masturbate she can feel it. And she can move my hand as well. I think this is how I developed the sexual craving of a woman with a penis. I've watched transvestite pornography to satisfy this craving, but it's usually short-lived because I am not attracted to the male physique or the male energy in general. What turns me on is the illusion that it's actually a woman. And I only watch the videos which feature a transvestite and woman. Now I feel completely embarrassed. But for the sake of science, I will keep this in the book. And it's really no big deal. I'm sure there are many others that find the idea of a woman with a penis attractive. I might as well add that I am a full supporter of the LGBTQ movement. No one has the right to tell you what gender your soul is or what sex preference you should have. You are only being true to yourself and your heart. It's not rocket science. Anyway, I also hear what seem to be angels. And I mean members of a highly advanced civilization that watch over us and Earth. There's really no need to embellish it, at least not anymore. But I kind of like calling them angels. All these hallucinations have distinct behaviors and tone of voice. And like I said before, they are basically caretakers. Sometimes they talk to me and comfort me. Other times they are stern. And sometimes they act like a stupid brain. I often find myself start to get lost in thinking it's real, but eventually come back to reality. And I'll be quite frank. A large part of me hopes that it's real. Not particularly that I was utilized for something like the shift, but even that I was just a mind control experiment or at least the angels. It doesn't really matter. I just hope there was a reason for all this suffering not only I went through, but also my family and friends. Why I did incredibly embarrassing acts in the public, and why I might be a recluse the rest of my life. Would anyone else feel different? I guess I can talk about avian now. Everything I do these days seems to revolve around it, from music to other hobbies such as recording video games or drawing. In the beginning, there was Inez. It's the name I used to represent my music back in high school. Later when I began writing again, I decided I needed a new name because I didn't want to risk the rights. So, Inahisha was born. And shortly after, I got the idea for avian. Don't ask me why I was drawn to this name, because I don't really know. But I stuck with it. And I already know what comes up if you search the internet. But that's not why I chose it. I wanted to represent my music, art, and philosophy. That's how I've always been. You might notice the seed of life symbol in my logo. And the iris behind it, with the light emanating from the middle point. And yes, it does have a deep-rooted meaning in metaphysics. I am proud to display my studies and personal experience about reality. But I will never let myself preach. I only hope to encourage others to perhaps challenge some of the deeper questions we all have. Why I am here? What is my purpose? Why do I suffer? Can I make it better? No longer am I the young revolutionist. Now, I just want a life of peace and to share this peace with others. If people ask me questions, I will answer. But I got my answers from the same place I think we all can, and that's within. A few books wouldn't hurt as well. Music is very important to me. I've found I am able to convey things I never could with words. I've never studied music theory and everything has been self-taught up to this point. And I think that exposing myself to all the different genres will in turn expand my palette. What more can I say except avian is me? Not that I want to call myself avian, but that everything about me I express through this representation. Maybe it's because I have shut myself off from the world, and I am just worried I won't be remembered. So now let's go a little bit into how an average day for me is. I wake up feeling like shit every morning because of the medication, then usually say hello to my hallucinations. I have 2 cups of coffee and about half a pack of cigarettes before I can finally say I'm awake. If I'm lucky enough to be busy on a project, or writing music, then that's what I'll do. Otherwise I'm either watching music videos, playing video games or watching internet streams. On some occasions I'll watch a movie or go for a walk. And if I'm really inspired I will exercise. Next thing you know it's 3 in the morning. I have a couple cups of coffee every night. Sometimes I go to bed earlier, usually when I'm not working on a project or music. But something like this book will keep me up until sunrise. I hate taking my medications. I loathe it. Because it is painful. Even though akathisia has been substantially lowered, I still have a number of other side effects I have to deal with. I have to wait until I'm really ready to take the medication. If I try to take it any sooner, it turns out to be a bad experience. And the waking up feeling terrible? That's there regardless of what time I go to bed. Believe me, I've tried. I know this is a very unhealthy sleeping schedule, but I have to do it. Not everyone will understand. And that's okay. I am just trying to live a happy life. And if that means waiting every night for the right moment to take my medications, then that's what I'll do. Who knows, maybe over time I'll go to bed earlier. Maybe the right time will change. But for now this is how it is. So the day ends, and I have to go through another rough morning. But during the day I can find enjoyment in video games or movies and even just reviewing my accomplishments. I find comfort in the amazing feedback and support I receive from family and friends, and even from the people of the world I've met online. But I often get depressed when I don't have the inspiration to create. Or when I start wishing I had a girlfriend and could have sex. Or realize how disconnected from society I am. I'll tell you right now that my lifestyle is terrible. But there is a reason for it. A huge reason, need I say. However, there is a lot that could be improved. And I feel things are getting better. Hell, they've been getting better for 5 years now. I could really use some help though. As I'm sure we all could. And it took years to even get to this point. I am still healing, and I know this. And I might never be able to fully heal these wounds, but it's worth the fight. I'll admit the thought of crossing over to an afterlife is very attractive and that I often wish my time would come soon, but I'm in this for the long run. I have a great support system. My family is always there for me when I need them. And I know not everyone is so fortunate. That some people have to carry all the weight on their shoulders. I know it's hard. It shouldn't be this way. Nobody should have to suffer like this when there's really nothing to fault. And this just doesn't go for mental illness. People around the world are suffering and it's not fair. I could have died before I got a chance to even live again. But I'm still ticking, however offbeat it seems. I really hope my story and this book can help others. Schizophrenia can be so poorly represented. Chapter 5, Akathisia. Akathisia, a movement disorder characterized by a feeling of inner restlessness and inability to stay still. Before I want to start, I want to clarify I do not have any degrees in psychiatry to back my findings. All I'm trying to do is tell you what I know from experience and my opinion on the matter. I think the topic of medication side effects deserves more priority in the mental health system. And that there should be more understanding to those who simply refuse medication. In my 2016 video, a large portion of the discussion was about akathisia. See, I spent years with this side effect without knowing it, and tried suicide many times. I don't want anyone to go through that. It was terrible. No matter what I did, I could never be comfortable. In fact, it was painful. I would lay down in bed tossing and turning, then get up to walk. I would walk until I finally got tired enough to lay back down. But even then I couldn't find peace. I was extremely depressed and suicidal because of it. Through both conservatorship I had to suffer like this. And when I was finally able to get back into society, I would eventually try to kill myself. At the same time I was fighting my hardest to not give in. I would spend time with my mother and little sister, struggling to enjoy it. But it strengthened me to hold on longer. I thought it was my body or hallucinations causing it back then. Although of course, I didn't see them as hallucinations. I would have panic attacks quite regularly, cursing at the hallucinations and sometimes begging for them to make it stop. I thought there was nothing I could do about it. I'll give my honest opinion that I do not believe akathisia is a livable condition. And there are many other side effects just as terrible. Sure, maybe they could help with schizophrenia, but I really don't think it's effective in the long run. It's scary to think that there are people out there locked up in a facility losing their mind because of this with no idea why. I guess the whole reason this is even acceptable is because you are supposed to balance the good with the bad. Antipsychotics are powerful. They can lock your jaws, stop reproductive fluids, make you too tired to do anything, and even make you gain weight, which in turn can cause depression. But the risk is worth the experiment. Because that's what I think doctors are doing to patients. They are experimenting. What might work for one person could be totally different for another. And if one medication doesn't work, we try another. And it seems this is the only choice we have for severe cases. I've watched plenty of documentaries and presentations to understand this. Okay, without this method I never would have found the right medication. Of course I had to be put on numerous brands first, but finally by sheer luck something worked. It's by no means perfect, but it's the best we can do. Some individuals might not be so lucky. For some people all these pills and shots don't have much of an effect. In fact, I think it could worsen their life or cause suicide, such as a side effect like akathisia. It is a simply terrible process, and I've met people who have spent their whole life being locked up only to get back out for a brief period of time then go straight back in. What really can we do? Medication has proven to be successful, maybe not all the time, but there's always a chance. Schizophrenia cannot be cured completely, at least not yet. But I also don't want to discredit other forms of treatment. Maybe medication really isn't the best choice for everyone and we should respect their wish to seek out more natural forms of therapy. But when the situation is so drastic where people could be hurt, what choice do we have? I know that I need medication. I've tried going off it many times over the years only for my symptoms to resurface. But I still cannot find peace with the situation because the side effects sometimes just feel unbearable. I just really have no choice. I have accepted that this could all be an illness, and that alone is a substantial step towards the healing process. And that if I don't want to lose what I have, that I must keep to my regimen. I'll admit, if I was still feeling akathisia, I never would have accomplished anything like I've done so far. In fact, I probably would have been conserved again if not dead. But I was fortunate enough my current medication for the most part does not have this side effect. So now let's jump back to the main subject. How could anything feel that terrible? Well, everyone should know there is much more in this world that can hurt you than a gun or knife. There is of course psychological torture, where you could drive most people to do anything you wanted if you knew their weakness and strengths. But I think a better example would just be alcohol. I think for most people after a long night of drinking you wake up and your head just hurts. Well, instead of an ice-cold beer, think about a little pill. And the more you take it every day, the worse you'll feel when you wake up. And instead of your head hurting, picture your body and mind tense. You can't relax your muscles, and you are gritting your teeth. There is nowhere to run for comfort, because no matter where you go you feel the same way. And people are forcing you to take the pills, or else you may never get to see the world again. I really don't know any better ways to describe it, but I felt akathisia deserved its own chapter in this book. I hope in time we find better ways to treat schizophrenia, and I know already we've made progress. But it might be a bumpy road until it is more understood and we won't have to make the choice over good and bad when all we are trying to do is get better. Chapter 6, Deeper Exploration. I've finally reached it. I've been looking forward to this chapter. What I want to do is briefly explain what I think schizophrenia is. I'm sure you can tell by now I'm very opinionated, but I try my hardest to take into account that we are each our own and my views could hold little weight. But I really want to explain what I've deducted from my own personal experience with this illness. I just hope that this could be helpful to others and maybe shed some light on the nature of hallucinations. I must remind you too that schizophrenia is a very broad diagnosis. So, I'll just do a quick synopsis. Basically, I think we all sort of have our own version of the universe. We all see it different, and what may seem beautiful to one person could be dull and drab to another. And yet when we find others with familiar views and opinions we can't help but bond. Now let's analyze what I first said. That we sort of have own version of the universe. Really think about that. That some people think that right this moment, there are angels in heaven. And some people might think aliens can read thoughts. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. We are just disposed to certain ideas that we find the most likely. The most likely. So if I told you one day that I'm going to make you schizophrenic by making your version of the universe alive, the only logical outcome should be what you know is true or not and what you think might be true. Because you are emotionally connected to a certain bias, so when something out of the ordinary catches your attention you are subconsciously redirected to your first theory by survival instincts. And now, what if I said that this new universe expands on itself by your thought and the real world you perceive around you? Because to have one you have to have two. It's like a never-ending spiral. So let's analyze a bit further. By now you might see the dilemma already. It's not working as it should. Well, that's because I told you beforehand that you are going to have schizophrenia. So your first reaction to a hallucination acted appropriately. But give it a little time. Do you really know I ever gave it to you? Say you are a person that believes in heaven and angels. It wouldn't surprise me that that's one of the first things you started hearing. Say maybe you're a conspiracy theorist. Again, it would make sense that aliens were talking to you. There could be so many factors. Like me, for an example. I thought I was the most popular dude in school. I believed my guitar playing was magnificent. And maybe there's some truth behind this, but what do you think I could start hearing? Does the guitarist scenario really seem that out of place? And what of the loud explosion? Could this all be based on a simple idea that aliens could be experimenting on me? That for almost 5 years I felt I was undergoing tests for the final shift scenario, all because a simple opinion of what's out there? However, there are things that even this theory cannot explain. That's where you have to decide where your heart lies. I've made my peace already. Whether I'm right to some degree on schizophrenia, or there really was an experiment or something grandiose, I honestly couldn't care less. All I want to do is be happy and spend time with my family for the rest of my life. And if I have to do it while listening to Zetas and military in my head, then so be it. Chapter 7, Final Thoughts. Well, this ended rather quick. Believe me, I had plans for a novel, but I can't help but feel I've said everything I wanted to say. I guess I could always write more later and elaborate, but I feel that the mission is accomplished. I don't know what it is I am experiencing. And I am scared. But I have also been able to start a good life regardless. And I am so happy that I was able to write this. I might not ever be like I was before my schizophrenia, but honestly I love who I am today. Of course I don't mean hallucinating. My God, point me to the cure and I'll run to it and never look back. But I mean my integrity and view of the world. How all this has made me a better person in the end. Since my 2016 video, and this short book will probably be what I am most known for, if there was anything I'd say to the world it would be this. And I quote my blog. I may not be perfect, but I know that I hope everyone here on earth can bask in the warmth without emptiness. To feel what holds true to their heart, and to see we are closer to each other than it seems. To find the strength to fight even when hope is lost. And to share this warmth, in hope that one day we can look down on the trails of our hopes and dreams and say we made it. Thank you for taking your time to listen to my story. Again, this book is available on Amazon and the Kindle store. You can find my music here on YouTube or Reverb Nation, as well as free downloads. Stay strong, everyone.